All right.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kathleen, for getting us started today. Thank you to Greater Hartford SCORE for providing these webinars, which helps their community to learn and grow. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today or watching the recording later on. I hope you get something out of this webinar that helps you along your podcasting journey. So today's webinar is all about how to use podcasting to build relationships and drive sales. So in today's webinar, I'd like to, I went too far. Hold on a second. Nope, there we go. In today's webinar, I'd like to have some key takeaways. So we're going to discuss what is a podcast, the basics, and some of the current stats around podcasting, why a podcast might be right for your business, some of the benefits and challenges of doing a podcast and how to overcome those challenges. And then we're going to dive into a structure for figuring out what your podcast could be about. And I think that that's something that a lot of webinars that I've seen about podcasting have kind of missed out on, is how to help you figure out what the podcast could be about. Because, you know, if you're on this webinar, you probably are thinking, I might want to do a podcast. I have no idea what to do it about. So we will definitely talk a lot about that later. So when you come out of this webinar, hopefully you'll have an idea of whether you'd like to continue along this path, and you'll have some steps to get started. So let's start with who am I? My name is Gail Tannenbaum. I am a marketing and communications consultant, and I specialize in content development like podcasts, video, written content. And I've been in communications roles for the past 30 plus years, and I've done things like technical writing, content writing, marketing, and within the last 5 years, I've gotten much more heavily into video production and, of course, podcasting. So I want to tell you a little bit about my podcasting experience so you can understand why I'm so passionate about it. I am the executive producer of a podcast called Made in America with Ari Santiago. And this podcast has made me believe in the power of podcasting for small and medium-sized businesses. So I want to tell you a little bit about it before we get started. This podcast started almost 4 years ago when I was working for an IT services company based right here in the Hartford area. And by the name, you may guess that it is indeed a manufacturing-focused podcast. The CEO and I started that podcast for two main reasons. One was to bring some value to the manufacturing community that we felt that we could bring them. And the second was for marketing. We wanted to be able to network with people in that industry, grow clientele in that industry, and build relationships that could have the potential to benefit the business down the road. As we started the podcast in the beginning, we just started with current clients and our direct contacts in the industry, and that went really, really well. So we were able to use that initial network to then bring in guests from other companies that we hadn't met yet, that we didn't know. And 4 years later, in May, we just completed our 200th episode. And other than making it to our 200th episode and lasting almost 4 years, there are two things that have proven to me the success of this podcast. One is, anecdotally, the CEO has actually become a bit of a celebrity in the manufacturing industry, and we were able to parlay those relationships from the podcast into speaking events of all sorts in all kinds of organizations, and we developed a much larger network of influence. People constantly stop him at events or email him to tell him how much they enjoy the podcast. So that's one way that we see the success of the podcast. But the other one is that the podcast doesn't just have fans and listeners, it is also turned into real revenue to the tune of a little over $4 million in the last 4 years. And that is absolutely nothing to sneeze at. And those new clients are made up of podcast guests that we've had on the podcast listeners, and those people who may have been influenced by the podcast during the company's sales process. So the podcast has worked on multiple levels. It's built relationships, it's spread brand awareness, it's built community, and it's introduced the CEO of that company to new people he may not have had the chance otherwise to have met. So with that background, let's go higher level and get into some podcasting basics. Let's talk about the key elements of a podcast. One, a podcast is an audio format. The majority of podcasts are available only through audio format. And while video production is becoming more prevalent, you do see the term video podcast, and it does lend itself more to some interesting social media content or some interesting web content. It is not necessary at all to have a video podcast. It is only the key element of a podcast is that it is audio. Case in point, the strength of audio. I listen to podcasts all the time. I actually listen to about 5 podcasts on a regular weekly basis and another 5 kind of off and on, maybe on a monthly basis. And I have never looked for a video version, even though I know that some are available. And mostly that's because audio is convenient and it's accessible no matter what you're doing. You could be cooking dinner or going for a run or driving home or wherever. It is just so easy to listen to a podcast rather than having to watch a screen. The second key element of a podcast is that it is available through an RSS feed, and RSS stands for really simple syndication. And syndication is the ability to publish or broadcast through a number of stations or apps. And this is what makes a podcast a show and not just a blog post or something that goes on your website or something that you send in an email. It is actually a show, just like a television show goes through syndication. It's pushed out and it's broadcast to its listeners, and its listeners are able to subscribe and follow, which will allow them to automatically download new episodes whenever they come out. And the third key element of a podcast is that it's accessible anywhere. As I mentioned already, podcasts can be accessed anywhere at any time on any device. And that is a key to podcasting. So let's move over to some podcast listener stats. These are some very recent stats, actually just released in March and April of this year. On the left is a graph by the Pew Research Center, and on the right is a graph by the Edison Research Center, and both of these are very highly touted research organizations within media research. The Pew graph on the left, this pie chart graphs a snapshot of all U.S. adults in December of last year, and it shows that about half of all American adults have listened to a podcast in the past year, and 20% listen a few times or more per week. Now, this is encouraging because while it's a large percentage of the population, there's still plenty of room for growth in that regular listenership. Whether it's monthly listeners or weekly listeners or multiple weekly listeners, there is plenty of growth to be had. And then on the right-hand side, you've got that Edison graph that shows the growth of listenership over time. And this is also a really encouraging graph. The bars represent the percentage of weekly podcast listeners since 2013 out of the entire US population over 12 years old. And it shows that the percentage of weekly listeners has been steadily growing. You'll see that small drop there, that small little dip in 2022. I actually watched a webinar done by this research organization, and they believe that that was unfortunate timing because their survey actually aligned with the release of COVID restrictions in January of 2022. So they perceive it as just basically bad timing. People wanted to get out of their house and weren't necessarily listening to podcasts as much at that exact time of their survey. But the data does show a very clear growth in regular podcast listening over the last 10 years, and experts expect that trend will continue. So let's talk about the differences between types of podcasts. And I am simplifying it to a great extent with this slide. But there are 2 types of podcasts that I'll talk about here, but it's really much more of a spectrum from the mass market to the narrow podcast. And we'll talk about both of them. So what is a mass market podcast? These are shows that you've most likely heard of, the big shows, right? The Joe Rogan Experience, the Huberman Labs, On Purpose with Jay Shetty. They're shows that appeal to a really large audience across a wide area, nationally or even internationally. And their goal is to have that really large listenership because they're making their money off advertising. They need that large listenership to pull in the high-paying advertisers. Now, mass market podcasts can still have a niche. They can be aimed at a particular industry, at a specific age range, even have a very specific genre. But potential audience, no matter what, is still really large. And the goal is still listenership that leads to advertising. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum is what some experts call the narrow podcast, or I've also heard it called niche podcasting or account-based podcasting. No matter what the name is that you hear, this narrow podcast brings a focus that is much tighter and much more niche, and it can be really focused into a specific audience by industry, by hobby, by location, age, gender, or a number of these different demographics. And the focus can be really tight and really small because the goals are very different. And this is where you want to be as a small or medium-sized business. You don't want to compete with those mass market or even, somewhere in the mid-market podcasts. Your goals are going to be different. And we'll talk about goals in a second. But there are some real benefits to going narrow versus mass market. And let's just talk a little bit about that right now. There are fewer concerns about listener numbers. Of course, you want listeners, but you're not necessarily going to be concerned about listeners because that's not necessarily how you're going to be making your money. And there's no advertising necessary. You don't have to advertise. I mean, you can. The opportunity is still there, but it's not necessary because advertising isn't where your big goals are going to lie. And if you do decide to advertise, you'll probably want to be a bit more careful to make sure that the advertising brings value, direct value to your very niche audience. There's also a little bit less concern about marketing and SEO for your podcast itself. You still want to use solid SEO tactics so people can find your podcast if they're interested in that niche, and you'll want to market it enough so that people know about it. But since you're not going for a huge audience, putting a lot of money or time or effort into marketing the podcast isn't necessarily vital to its success. So why should you do a podcast? Well, a podcast can help you meet your business goals. I'm not going to dive into defining your business goals. I hope you have those defined already, or at least you've thought about them regularly. And if you don't, or you haven't, I am sure that there is a SCORE volunteer that would be happy to help you out to figure those out. And I'm sure you can reach out to SCORE at the end of this video, at the end of this webinar, if you're like, you know what, I don't know what my business goals are, so let me get some help. But for today, let's run through some of the goals that podcasting can help you meet. And I want to make sure you understand it's not a quick fix solution for your sales pipeline problems. This is a long-term strategy. So here are some of the reasons why you should do a podcast. Relationships. So, oops. Just going to move this. Sorry about that. So podcasting can help you build relationships and help you develop know, like, and trust. KLT. People do business with people they know, people they like, and people they trust. So even though you want to have listeners and you want to produce great content, the biggest focus of your podcast is on relationships. It's going to be first with your guests, and depending on your podcast, this could be current customers, could be prospects, potential business partners, experts in a related field, lots of options, but that's the first step of building relationships. Second, you're going to build relationships within your community, and that can be your local community, your industry's community, or your customers' industry community even. And finally, you're building relationships with your audience. So the next reason to do a podcast is to exhibit your expertise. And solo podcasts can be great at allowing you to do this when they're designed well. But you have to make sure that they're providing value. They're not just a big infomercial for your service or your product. They need to provide value to your audience beyond just what you're offering. The third reason to do a podcast is it allows you to meet potential customers that you may not have otherwise been able to get to. Generally, people enjoy talking about themselves and their business and their hobbies. They like to share what they know. And it's much easier to get somebody to come and have a nice conversation with you on a podcast than it is if you're making a sales call or you're meeting somebody at a networking event necessarily. And I look back at the Made in America podcast as my example for this. At this point, we've met nearly 200 different business leaders that we never would have necessarily had the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with. And we try to focus on meeting people that are within the range of potential customers, and that is something that you can do with your podcast as well. The fourth reason to do a podcast, you can generate a ton of marketing content just based off a single podcast. So of course, there's the long form of the podcast itself, which is going to be pushed out to all the podcast apps, but you can also put it on your website. You can send it out in email campaigns. There are lots of options just for even using that long form of the podcast. But then you can also create a ton of short form content. And that's going to be things like clips, right? Which are either in audio if you're doing an audio-based podcast, or even video if you have video for your podcast as well. You can create quotes from pulled from your podcast that you can also use on social media. And with the Made in America podcast as an example, each podcast episode we usually pull 5 to 6 clips per episode, and those are generally 1 to 3 minute video clips that are quick hitters, important segments of information that we've pulled from the podcast. And these clips generate many, many more times views than the long form. And I can even take this week's podcast episode as an example. Over Memorial Day weekend, you kind of see people were not necessarily interested in long form content. Maybe we had 100 views on the podcast that was available over the long weekend. But, people were still hitting their phone while they were on the beach or hanging out with their family. And so the social media clips actually got somewhere close to 2,000 hits. So, that's a huge difference, long form versus the short form. 100 listens of your long form content versus 2,000 listens of your short form content. It's just, a massive push of content. And then you can also pull written content from your podcast. So you can use that podcast content as a basis for blog posts, for keeping your website up to date, or for pulling information to create email campaigns. There's just tons and tons of ways to use the content that you're creating from your podcast. And the fifth reason to do a podcast is just general brand awareness. It's really, really good and strong for both your personal brand awareness, especially if you're a solo entrepreneur or a business leader. You can really grow your personal brand, but it's also great for business brand awareness. Just gets your name out there so much more, whether that's through listenership or whether that's through guests that really enjoyed their time on the podcast, or whether that's organizations that help you spread your podcast. And then finally, all of these tactics put together can be an incredibly successful way to develop new sales in the long term. So I want to make sure that you clearly understand that podcasting is not a short-term solution. It is not going to be a quick fix. You're not going to do a podcast and then suddenly, at least most likely, you're not suddenly going to have, 100 new sales or 5 new clients. It is to build relationships. It's certainly possible that a guest that just came on is going to go, hey, I could really use your service, or oh, I saw your product over there and I really could use that. It's possible. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's much more likely that you're going to be spending time building relationships and friendships that eventually over time turn into business relationships. But not everything is without challenges, and not everyone is meant to do a podcast. But these challenges aren't necessarily reasons to give up. There are strategies that can help you overcome them. So let's go through some of the podcast challenges. Number one is commitment. I like to say, as I keep saying, this is a long-term strategy. If you're going to put forth the time and effort to do a podcast, I would really suggest committing to at least 6 months, minimum 3 months, to determine whether this is going to work out. There's no strategy to get past having to put in the commitment and the effort. It's just a challenge you have to decide to take on or not. But it can be a challenge for some people to really commit to doing this when the effort is going to be long-term, not necessarily short-term. So you have to consider that about yourself and your business needs. The second challenge is definitely time. Podcast absolutely does take time. There are strategies to get around it. But no matter what, podcasting is going to take some of your time. So one of the strategies to get around the amount of time that podcasting takes is to create a consistent routine and a consistent process, and that will help you pare back the time that you're spending over time, and it will help you get efficient. So creating a consistent routine and process is absolutely key to the ability to consistently do a podcast. And then the other thing that you can do, the other strategy that will give you back some of your time is, well, you can pay for some help, right? How much you do pay depends on you and the time that you've got available, because you can just pay for someone to find you guests, or you can pay for someone to just do the technical parts, the audio engineering. But you can also get a person to do everything, or a team to do the whole thing, and all you do is just show up to the podcast and host it. Heck, you can even find groups that will host it for you on behalf of your company. But that gets us to our next podcasting challenge, which is expense, right? So hiring people is expensive, but podcasting itself can be extremely inexpensive if you are able to do it yourself. Or it can cost thousands of dollars per episode if you need a lot of help, or you want a really high production value. But in my opinion, you don't need a super high production value to create a successful narrow podcast. On the tech side, you can get away with just some basics to keep the expenses really down. So podcast distribution service is it's only about $50 a month, and some decent recording equipment is a few hundred. But on the flip side, it's possible to go crazy on top quality recording equipment, build yourself a whole recording studio. There are pros and cons of each. I'm not going to dive into all of the expenses in this webinar. I actually do have a blog post on my website that digs into costs more completely, and I'll show you the information on my website at the end of this webinar, so you'll have that and you can go take a look. On the help side of things, it's also a spectrum, right? You can pay just a little bit to have a little bit of help, or you can pay a lot and get all the help in the world. There are podcast virtual assistants that you can hire for maybe $100-$200 per episode, and there are podcast consultants all the way up to full marketing agencies that specialize in this kind of thing that will cost you potentially thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars per episode, depending on the production value that you're putting into your podcast. The fourth podcasting challenge is technical know-how. Now, that really depends on your perspective. The basics of podcasting aren't too terribly difficult to learn. I mean, if you've learned how to use your smartphone, or you've managed to figure out how to do video calls through COVID, you can learn how to podcast on your own. There are podcast recording platforms that are as simple as a Zoom call, but there are also setups that are as complicated as a low-budget TV show. You may want to learn a little bit of audio engineering to help you make a better sounding podcast, or again, you can hire someone to do this for you as well. So the technical know-how doesn't have to be a stumper. Podcasting can actually be very simple. And in fact, there are every year there are new podcast recording applications that are just getting more and more simple and do more and more of the work for you. So the fourth podcasting challenge is your speaking ability, right? And there are two ways to think about this, right? Some people are natural at speaking, and some people take a little bit more practice. But if you can carry on a conversation on the phone or a video chat, you can record a podcast. But practice does make perfect. Don't expect your podcast to be amazing the first time out. In fact, there are experts who say you should probably record a podcast or two that you don't even necessarily plan on releasing. And if they turn out great, that's great. But the practice will help you a lot. And as I think back on my experience with the Made in America podcast, the interview skills at the beginning just, not nearly what they are today. It really took a number of episodes, even for our CEO who hosts that podcast, or that company CEO who hosts the podcast, to get better at it and develop over time. And the other thing about speaking is that you don't have to be the one who's speaking most of the time. If you have an interview-based podcast, you're listening much more than you're speaking. There's a lot less to worry about. Now, there's still, interview skills that you have to learn. Asking questions and follow-up questions is a skill that you can develop over time, just like anything else. But it doesn't have to be perfect, and it will get better over time. And then the final podcasting challenge is I have no idea what to talk about. And that is what we're going to talk about in our next section of the webinar. So I'm going to help you walk through that challenge. But before we do that, Kathleen, do we have any questions that we've gotten along the way?
No, we don't.
Okay. Then I will just move on to the next section. All right, the question of the hour, and it's not an easy one to answer. What should your podcast be about? Of course, I can't help every one of you on this webinar figure out exactly what to focus your podcast on without meeting you and learning about your business and your prospects and your products and your service and your interests. But I can give you a framework that helps you think about it on your own and will help you focus in on a topic. And I call it the SPICE strategy. The letters of SPICE kind of make up the things that we're going to talk about. So just very quickly, and we're going to go through all of these. We've got service or sale, people, interests, community, and education. So let's go ahead and break those down a bit. So the first one, S for service or sale. Hopefully this should be the easy one for you. You should know what your service is and what your product is. But that's, it's something you need to, really make sure that you understand as you are working on what to have your podcast about. So what is your service and product, and how are you selling it? Keep in mind, or rather, who are you trying to sell it to? And keep in mind that your podcast doesn't have to be related to your product or service at all. It's an option. It's not a necessity. And, when I look back at the Made in America podcast, for example, this is a podcast that is done by an IT organization, but it is 100% a manufacturing focused podcast. And that's because that company wanted to relate to their desired audience, and we'll talk about audience in just a second. But it can be related to your service or your products. But again, if you're going to do that, it has to be value driven. You can't make it an infomercial. You can't have a weekly or a bi-weekly podcast that is just simply an infomercial about yourself and your service and your product. It has to provide value around what you do. All right, let's move on to P for people, or in marketing terms, we call this personas. Who are the people that you want to serve with your podcast? Define them clearly and completely so you can determine who would make the best guests, who the target audience would be, and who you're trying to educate or build a relationship with. And you want to think about the whole person, right? What are their complete demographics? What's their age, their gender, their education level, their occupation or seniority, their geographic location? You want to think about all of the different demographics of your potential audience, your guests, the people that you are going to serve. And those people that you might want to serve with your podcast could be current customers or clients, prospects, referral sources, strategic partners. And I want to put this one out here because I don't think too many people are using podcasts in this way, but the people that you might serve with your podcast could be people you want to hire or retain. It could be your own people within your company. So I added this in here to get you thinking, because there are just so many industries right now that are desperate to keep or add young adults, or even older adults for that matter. So consider whether you could use a podcast as a tool for recruitment and retention. And I have actually seen this done successfully in medium-sized or larger companies where they have actually an internal podcast that successfully helps them to retain their people. Their podcast might be introducing their leadership, interviews with their leadership, interviews with new people, interviews about new positions, and I've seen that done really successfully. So it's something to consider moving forward as we see the real crunch in the workforce. Okay, we got I for interests. What are the people that you want to serve interested in? What are they going to find valuable? What will help them in their lives or their business? But it doesn't always have to be business related, right? So what entertainment might they like? And I don't know if this exists anywhere, but a law firm that has a local golf related podcast, that could be really great. Or a marketing firm that introduces some small local businesses to their community, that could really work out well as well. Next, what are your interests? What could you continue to speak about weekly, biweekly, monthly? What can you speak to people about regularly? Or, what do you want to learn through the lifetime of your podcast? Because if you get bored, your guests will be bored and your audience will be bored too. So you've got to make sure that your interest actually aligns with the podcast as well. And on the flip side of interests, you also want to think about the concerns of the people that you want to serve with the podcast, right? What keeps them up at night that you might have solutions for, or you might be able to speak to, or you might be able to find other experts to answer with you. All right, let's move on to C for community. Is there a community that you can serve with your podcast, whether that's your local community, the community of the industry, of your customers, or your own industry's community? Each industry and many niches even within each industry have community groups and organizations. And these predefined communities are a great way to find guests, to spread word about your podcast, and to increase awareness quickly. So what would this community that you want to serve as a whole, what would they want to hear about? What can you do a podcast podcast with that would help you make strong relationships within that community. And as again, I think back on the Made in America podcast, a lot of the success of that podcast was based around the manufacturing community, which is really, really strong in the state of Connecticut. There are a number of manufacturing organizations, and really serving them and their needs and the needs of their community helped us to find guests, to spread the word about the podcast. It really actually made things a lot easier as far as building out the podcast. And then finally, E for education. This is something we've kind of talked about all along. What can you educate the people that you want to serve with this podcast about? Are there topics that you are extremely confident in or you have expertise in? Are there topics you think would be of great value to your audience? Even if you yourself aren't an expert in those things, the experts can be the guests that you have on. What will resonate with the people that you want to serve? And what will they be excited to listen about? Are there technologies that they should learn about? Are there new theories in their niche area? Are there new offerings or services that they might need to learn about? Those are all things that you could do podcast episodes about. So there are a lot of different ways that you can educate through your podcast. When you look at these 5 areas, service is sales, people, interests, community, education together as a whole, it can really help you think more thoroughly and more structured about a potential podcast topic. And I just want to end with an example, a quick example of a client of mine that went through this process. So they went through the SPICE strategy. There's a lot of words on that particular page, so I'll walk you through it a little bit. So their service was a new service. They were building websites for a very particular niche that was designed to help this niche with their unique communication needs. The people that they wanted to serve were their clients and prospects and referral sources. And the demographics of that group was they were all leaders within the organization of this particular niche, generally male, generally between the ages of 40 and 60, and this was a nationwide group, a nationwide niche. And the interests of this group, they had particular concerns about how to effectively, safely, and legally communicate with all of their constituents in this particular niche. And then as for C, community, there is already a really strong community built around this particular niche. And then E for education, as we were working through this, we realized it would be really beneficial to share lessons learned and best practices from other leaders within this niche who have had success with their communication efforts. So the podcast idea that we landed on for this client, for this service, was that the podcast could have 2 types of episodes, right? They could have interview episodes where they interviewed either niche leaders that were succeeding with their communication structure, and those leaders could share how they accomplished this success. They could start by interviewing current customers to build stronger relationships with those customers, and they could meet new prospective customers that way by asking them onto the podcast to talk about their success in this area. And then the other type of interview episodes could be with legal or legislative experts in this area, which is just great across the board for educational purposes and really will set this company apart as a go-to source of information. And then the second type of podcast episode is a monologue episode. So I think I forgot to mention in the beginning, this was a Connecticut marketing agency. You can see that on the page. So obviously this particular company has some expertise in communication and marketing strategy. So these monologue solo episodes could be used to share their own personal expertise in this area and educate on best practices practices for achieving successful communication. And it absolutely would set them apart as a go-to source in this area. So basically, that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. So I hope it gave you some food for thought. I would love to turn it over to Kathleen. Kathleen, it looks like I landed on that 45 minutes just about that I thought it was going to take. So happy to turn it over to Kathleen and see if we have any questions that came up during this part of the webinar.
We do not have any open questions written out at this point. And what I want to remind everybody of is, if you don't know where the Q&A part is, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen and you kind of see a menu where there's mute, unmute, etc., it's probably under the more, unless you have your screen stretched out, it will say Q&A, and you just type in there your question, and we will either answer it live or, well, at this point we will answer it live, unless it would be better in writing. In some cases, it might be better in writing.
Right.
So I've got two. Go ahead, Gail.
Well, I was just going to say, if it's a, a particular question, very specific to your business, I'll show my my email information in the next screen, and you can always email me after this. But if it's something a little bit more general, or even if it's specific and we continue to have time, feel free to put it in the chat.
Yep. So first question is, do we have access to a recording of this? Yes, you do. You not only have access to a recording, but you also have access to Gail's handout that she's going to provide, and in PDF form, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Yes. So that no matter what kind of device you have, you can access it. So you will get an email probably tomorrow with the link to the recording, as well as link to the information from Gail. The next question is from Anna. She says, can you share the website, please? I'm not certain which website we're talking about, the SCORE website or Gail's website. And if it's Gail's website, she's put it on the screen.
There we go.
If it's the SCORE website, please let us know and we will share that with you as well. All right. Crystal, if we have our idea and we know who we are talking to, what is the next step? Like, how do we actually physically get started? Do we use Zoom and record that?
I would say that Zoom is absolutely an option. You can do it that way. Zoom is probably not the best platform that is available at this point for podcasting, but it is possible. And actually, Zoom is doing more. I haven't actually researched Zoom in a little while, but I heard recently that Zoom is doing more for podcasting. But there are other organizations with very similar platforms to Zoom that seem to be stronger for podcasting, and just one of them off the top of my head is called riverside.fm. I would recommend taking a look at that one. It's a very straightforward platform, but it also has some editing capability that Zoom does not have. It also focuses a little bit more on audio strength rather than video strength. I think Zoom still focuses more of its bandwidth on video. And if you're going to do a podcast, while yes, you want the video to be decent, you really want the audio to be as strong as possible, because just even from when you're on a call and it kind of breaking up, or the sound isn't good, it's so much harder to listen to it. It's so much more work to listen to something that doesn't have really high quality audio. So you really want your audio to be as good as absolutely possible. So the next step I would also talk about, not just in the technology of how to record it, what would be the technology of the actual hardware, right? You're getting a really decent microphone. Now, a decent microphone doesn't have to cost even more than $100. You can get a great microphone for $100 these days that'll just simply plug into your laptop and you will be ready to go. Can you spend a whole lot more money than that? Absolutely. Do you need to? probably not.
And I want to chime in here too and say that it also matters the quality of the microphone that your guest has. And so one of the worst is wired earbuds because they've got the wire and the microphone is hanging down. It's often scraping against the shirt of the person talking when they're not talking as soon as they move their head. And now that's on the recording. So some people actually ship microphones to their guests and say, please use this, plug this into your laptop or whatever. Some people have suggestions, please do not use anything wired. It's better to have a Bluetooth version because at least you won't have that going, the scraping noise going on. But definitely the quality in to some degree equals quality out. You can't fix everything. As we say in music, you can't fix it all in the mix. So if you have a lot of background noise for whatever reason, it's really hard to get that out. So that's what you want to pay attention to on the front end is reducing the noise level on the front.
Right. And then also the location of where you and your guest are going to be sitting, right? You don't want to sit in a really echoey room. Even if you have a great mic, your echoey room is going to bounce your voice around and it's going to have this kind of chorus effect into the mic. And same thing for your podcast guests. So if you are going to do these remote style podcasts, I would highly recommend having kind of a quick tester call ahead of time to make sure that their equipment, their location is good enough. And if you're also going to record them in video, you want to make sure they don't have anything too awkward behind them, or they don't have light, streaming right on their back, right behind them, things that'll make it hard to watch. But again, since you're mostly going to focus on the audio, I think Kathleen's thought about you definitely don't want that hanging mic with the bumping up against their lapel the whole time. Did that answer our question?
If not, feel free to ask a follow-up question. All right, the next person, does long form or short form podcasts perform better?
There actually isn't a consensus on this. The consensus I've heard is it needs to be as long as it needs to be and no longer. And this was by a podcasting expert that I listen to regularly. And so, it's kind of funny to hear the experts say something so absolutely generic and non-helpful. But that's the truth of it, right? Every podcast is going to be a little bit different, but what you don't want to do is drag it along, right? So, it depends on what your podcast is going to be about, how many people are going to be talking, what the content specifically is. You could do a super successful 10-minute quick hitter podcast, or you could do a super successful 3-hour-long podcast. It shocks me that 3-hour-long podcasts are successful, but I've heard of quite a few, surprisingly, that are, ridiculously long and still super successful. So it could go in any direction.
And it's partly going to depend on the audience. And it's also going to partly depend on the subject matter. There are certain subjects that you can't possibly get into in a short period of time. A lot of what Tim Ferriss talks about, for example, I don't think he has one that's under an hour and a half. And whereas if you're trying to speak to busy moms who are commuting to the office and that's the only time they have to do anything, then you want to make your podcast shorter than the average commute time, which is generally 20 minutes. So it's going to depend on who it is you're speaking to, as well as what it is you're talking about. Some things can be easily broken down into small bites and some things not so much.
Yeah, great advice. Absolutely.
All right, the next person is asking, is the podcast live or recorded and played later?
Most podcasts are recorded and played later. In fact, it's not actually a podcast if it's live. That's live streaming. You can call it a live streaming podcast, but a podcast is actually recorded and then uploaded to a distribution service that sends it out.
Now, I do know a guy who often lets people sit in and watch him recording his podcast live. So he does a live stream on Facebook or YouTube or LinkedIn or whatever. And then, but it's really him recording his podcast. So you get to be a fly on the wall while he's doing it. So he's getting 2 hits for 1 in a sense.
Yeah. And that's all
That's
about creating more marketing content, right? If you can
Yeah.
live stream and record it and use it both ways, I mean, that's a win-win.
The next question is, how do we find podcasts to watch?
So, I mean, there are some platforms that have video podcasts, but mostly you're going to find them on YouTube. So you might find a podcast that you enjoy listening to through your podcast app, and you could do a quick little search, or go to their podcast webpage, and pretty much every podcast is going to have a link to a webpage that will point you to whether and where to find those video podcasts. But most of the time you're going to find that on YouTube.
I have them on Spotify as well.
Yes.
And my podcast app, I have an Android phone. My podcast app is called Podcast Addict, and it has recently started supporting video podcasts as well.
Oh, good to hear.
Yeah,
Great.
because the Apple podcast app, I don't think it does.
No.
Yeah, I don't think they've changed that app in quite a few years. So
Nope.
If you have an iPhone, you can't use the podcast app to see them, but Podcast Addict for Android users does. I haven't done it because it's so small. I'm like, I'll just go to YouTube, because most people have them on YouTube as well. But definitely Spotify is one of the bigger alternatives to YouTube, and you can either just listen or you can watch it as well.
Yeah. But the benefit of the
Go ahead, Gail.
I was just going to say, but the benefit of the audio, listening to the audio podcast is you're not stuck, watching it on your phone or sitting at a computer. You can just be going about your day, going for your walk, doing, making dinner, and listen to it at the same time.
Yes. Can you talk about how to distribute your podcast to all of these places, like how your podcast would get sent around, because there's so many options now? Or it used to be only on Apple, and then it expanded beyond Apple. And so now, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, there are multiple podcast, distribution apps, right? Who will say, you upload it to just one location, and through that app, you will set up where you want it to be distributed to. Now, you might as well distribute it to as many places as you possibly can, but there's always some kind of setup to it, right? So if you want this distribution app, and personally, I prefer the Libsyn app, Libsyn, but there are many other options of that kind of service. But every place that you want to send it to has some kind of setup, right? So it's not just as easy, unfortunately, as telling a service like Libsyn, hey, I want to send it here and here and here and here and here. There is always some process, and sometimes the process can be done through Libsyn itself. You can say, hey, Libsyn, I want you to send it to, Spotify. I don't remember if Spotify is one that they do this with, but I want to send it to Spotify, and then within that app, they'll go, okay, we'll help you set it up for Spotify, and we'll walk you through the steps. But sometimes, like the Apple podcast, there is a whole different process where you've got to go to set up the location for your podcast to land. So you're not going to have to be uploading your podcast to all these different places, but you do have to set up almost the landing spot for it. And then you tell your distribution app, all right, send it over there. I want it there. And all right, I've set up this landing spot on Spotify, send it over there. And you know, it takes a little bit of time on the front end, but once it's set up, that's it. You just upload it to one place, that one place distributes it for you, and you're good to go. And there are even some of these apps, and I think Libsyn started doing it now as well, that you can upload video and it will, well, actually they can't upload video yet, but you can upload audio and it will kind of turn it into a video to directly go to YouTube. Personally, I prefer uploading directly to YouTube rather than using some third party, but that is becoming more possible. There are more options for uploading even to YouTube directly from these distribution apps.
And if somebody wants to get started, because this sounds very complicated, do you have any recommended resources for walking people through the mechanics of the setup?
Well, I'm happy to help. So that is definitely a service that I offer. But a lot of these apps have very clear instructions on how to do these things too. So if you want to do it yourself, it is, you know, it's certainly possible. It's not any more challenging than, you know, reading a step-by-step process, which sometimes can be a little challenging on these websites. But there are, you know, plenty of, like I said, there are podcast consultants such as myself who can help you with that kind of thing.
Great. We have no more open questions.
All
So
right. All right.
thank
Well,
you.
I'm just going to plug the email once more that's going to get sent out to you. SCORE is going to be sending out this email, and it will have a link to a podcast startup checklist that talks about everything that I just talked about. Some of the questions that were just asked as well. There's some more information on there, and that's going to be available for you to download with a link that's going to come on that email. So please check that out. If you would like any more information directly from me, please feel free to reach out to me by email, or you can go on my website. There's a contact us form on there you can fill out. You can even give me a call, you know, whatever works best. I'm happy to, you know, just kind of go through some ideas or, just to start, or, you know, if you're really like, hey, I want to get started with this, but I cannot possibly do this myself, feel free to give me a call as well.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Gail. Thank
All
you for
right.
your time today, and thank you for everyone for coming. I want to remind you that when you get the link to the replay, it's going to be on our YouTube channel. And while you're there, you might want to subscribe, because we have a whole bunch of other videos that are available that were former workshops on all kinds of subjects: marketing, finance, website, technology, starting a business, etc. And so those are all free, just like our coaching is free. And so we offer you that opportunity to avail yourself of that and turn on the notification bell so you get notified when we put a new one out, which will be today or tomorrow, which will have Gail on it. And you'll get that email, but if you want to know about other ones, you'll get notified via YouTube. Thank you so much for attending today. We've loved having you, and we look forward to seeing you on another episode of SCORE Workshops. I'm going to pause the recording.